All right, hi everyone. We're going to start on chapter 2.5 in architecture, and I believe that's page 258 in the new text. I hope everyone's doing well, and I hope you're getting through this time as well as you can. It's difficult, it's kind of a scary time, but I trust things will get better, and we just are going to do the best we can as instructors to help make class interesting for you. It's not my choice to go online, but everyone's having to do it, so we'll just make the best of it, and I wish you all the very best and pray that everything's going well with you. Now, we're going to start on architecture today, which is the next chapter in the text, and I say this in the notes, and you'll see it there, that architecture is the art and science of designing buildings, bridges, and other structures. Well, the thing that I want you to remember, all the art forms that we talked about so far, we talked about drawing and painting and printmaking and all kinds of things, sculpture most recently, photography, video, so on, all different arts that we can talk about. Architecture is one of the arts, and it's the one that has the most influence on our daily lives, because think about it, otherwise you'd be outdoors, and I don't know if you've camped out or not, but you know how important architecture is to our daily lives. If you've ever been out in bad weather, camping, and you understand the importance of structures and buildings. But beyond giving us a shelter, buildings have an artistic side to them, and you're not just utilitarian. So we're going to talk about some of those aspects too. And so we'll go to that. I'm going to switch back to one of the slides here, and I'll stop here for just a moment. And I'll get rid of my cam, and I'll just go to the slides. Here we go. Here we go with the architecture presentation. And this is the designed by Sinan. This is a mosque in Istanbul, Turkey, designed in 1557. We'll talk about domes and the connection of domes and arches and so on. You notice the amount of light that there is in the structure here. Besides the artificial light, all the skylights and windows, lighting is a very important part of the design, and we'll talk about all that later. Your author discusses it on page 260. And here's a design for the World Trade Center. We're going to talk a little bit about the World Trade Center later. Have a little video that I want to watch on monuments and so on related to the World Trade Center Memorial. But here's the original design for this. So architects may start very simple, and yet they can design amazing structures from simple designs like this one. Now this is the Taos Pueblo. Some of you may have visited this. It's a pre-Columbian structure. The base part of it, this says pre-1500. Well, before Columbus came to America in 1492, this structure existed. And it's nothing more than adobe buildings, which is just mud and straw and other materials sometimes added in. Some wood structure in there, timbers and so on, as they build this up. But this is an amazing structure, and they will only let you visit part of this because it's still, today, it's still lived in. It's a dwelling place, and it's kind of a sacred site to the people there at Taos. But if you ever get to visit one of these pueblos, it's a pretty amazing thing. It takes constant maintenance. You can see some cracks there in the foreground on that wall, and you have to keep plastering it with mud. But it's an amazing structure. There are adobes that I've been in before, and some that exist in Lubbock even, that are, you would never know that they were adobes. There's some right across from Tech that are adobe houses. But it's an ancient building technique, people using what they had. And the authors put this Soho lofts in there. If you've ever been to New York City, you've seen these loft buildings. We'll talk about how that's done a little bit later. One thing I want you to make sure that you have in your notes is this word facade. Facade really comes from the face, the same word, Latin-based word, we get our word for face. But here's the facade. My architecture friend, who used to say he was an architect and said he was designing a fake A for a building, which he meant a facade, but it's the front, it's the face of the building. The facade is the part that we normally see. Here's looking at St. Peter's Basilica and the Vatican. And here are the pyramids there, and the three main pyramids. There are lots of pyramids there. But these are structures, and they were designed for purpose, not to live in, but architectural skill in designing and planning these amazing structures. We'll talk about those later. Here's the Ziggurat of Ur. These used to be in the text. They've changed it a little bit, but this is fired brick over a mud brick core, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. One thing I want you to consider is there are all kinds of structures in history in our area. Now, here's the Quanah Parker Trail Arrow in Loveland at Lobo Park. We had this placed a few years ago. I was working with the Historical Commission to put this in, and we dedicated it. And so there's one of the arrows, but it was to show the different places where Quanah Parker lived here on the South Plains and visited. And there's the one in Morton, Cochran County. And here's the one that you all have in Plainview. And they were doing a blessing ceremony. We actually had some of Quanah's family come and do a blessing when the students came that day. And they offered a prayer in the native language and the Comanche language. And then they offered a prayer because many of these people are Christians. And they belong to the Nazarene Church. So they offered a prayer to God and a blessing to the four winds. And it was a very special thing. Now here's Quanah Parker, if you've never seen him. And he was half white. His mother was captured by the Comanches. And he was born, she was the wife of one of the chiefs of the Comanche Nation. And so Quanah was born sort of between both worlds. And here is this amazing war bonnet. And that horse he's on doesn't look like much, but it could outpace the cavalry horses by far. And you see in the background there, the reason I've interjected this is this structure that's made of native buffalo hide sewn together, and these structures are very amazing. I don't know if you've ever been in a teepee or not. This is the one that they had set up for a while in Cache, Oklahoma, which is near Fort Sill. Comanche teepee. And I'm not sure if that was done in buffalo hide, it may be canvas. And then there's Quanah Parker's house in the background. So Quanah went from being on the plains, subsisting on buffalo, and then having to leave that way of life, and the Comanches were put on the reservation there near Fort Sill and other places. And then they built this huge house for it, and it still exists there. It's kind of in bad shape. It looks better here than when I saw it a few years ago, but it still exists, and there's an effort to try to keep it, to restore it and keep it. But Quanah went from living in a buffalo hide lodge to this two-story house. So his structures changed. The Spanish who came here with the first explorers lived in something very similar to that, and here's one of the tents that they lived in. We know from archaeological evidence that they were near Floydada because the journals say that they were hit by a huge hailstorm, huge hailstones that scattered the horses and the men, and they had a camp set up, but it demolished their camp. They found some of the crossbow points and some of the pottery that was broken in that hailstorm and so on. And they know they camped out there just below the Cap Rock in present-day Floydada around 1540. That's the depiction of it. People have always used what they had. They found the remnants of this 15,000-year-old structure in Ukraine made with mammoth bones and using hides and earth. These people just, if you're wanting to get a shelter, get out of the weather, you do what you can. You use what you have. In Mesa Verde in Colorado, the Four Corners area, is this amazing structure here and set of structures. The people came in and they used stone, they used adobe, and they made these structures under the overhang of the cliffs there, and they were very safe from war-like bands that would come in there, and they could store their grain, they could stay in shelter and be safe. It's like a multi-story apartment house here. And these ladders go down to Kivas, which is where they worship. And there's another view of Cliff Palace. Now I think I'm going to give you some virtual tours. One of those is for Mesa Verde National Park, but I'll put that on Blackboard later. But if you've ever visited this, you know how amazing it is, and hope you get to go there if you haven't. This is in the text, page 262, and it shows one of the pyramids there in Guatemala, and the Mayan temple, and these were built with stone, stacked on stone, and there was no mortar. It was just stone fit together to make this this pyramid structure, the temple. And it shows the platforms there and built up to that load-bearing structure, so they had to have good foundation to build up that much weight on the stone. And the post and lintel construction, so these posts upright, usually using stone, and sometimes it could be layers of stone, but usually a post, a column, and then a piece that went across and spanned it. So we call that post and lintel. Y'all excuse me. Post and lintel structure. And Stonehenge is sort of a post and lintel structure, but we also call it a monolith. It's a monolithic structure, which means that, or some people say megalith, but it is using these stones, and this was never a structure to live in. Some people think it was to observe the seasons and as a ritual purpose, and there are burials nearby. We'll talk about this later on. And this is sort of a post and lintel structure, but these are also considered to be megalithic structures. And you see the post and lintel structure here, the Temple of Amun-Re in Karnak, Egypt. And they're using multiple stones to make the columns here, but those support the weight of the lintel or the large stone on top and span that. Now here's Machu Picchu in Peru, and I'm not giving you the page numbers of these. Previous illustration was in there, but this one used to be in the text. But Machu Picchu is a site that's easily visited now. I've known folks that have gone there. I'd love to see it myself someday. I think I'll have that in the virtual tours too, where you can go and see this on your computer or your device. But the Incas built this by taking stones and making them fit so tightly. They say you can't get a knife blade or even a piece of paper between some of these stones. They're so well fit, and they could cut them and grind them off with grindstones using the limestone that was native to the area. So that's dry masonry construction, and they're using just pieces of stone put together so well that they don't need any cement between them, anything to stick them together. Now, we'll talk about parts of a column, and the Greek architecture uses this, and it's still used today. You can see it all over, even in our county courthouses. You can see it all over Lubbock, Plainview. Here's a column. The shaft has a base to it, and it has a top called the capital. And we have three different types of capitals. This shows the Doric on the left, the most simple kind. You see the capital there is just a smooth, rounded top. Sometimes they're square, but usually they're rounded, but it's just simple. You see the second one is like a scroll, and you see that the scroll there is called Ionic, and the third one is the more decorative type. I'm going to switch here and see if I can get back on my camera. A scroll, just like the scroll would be a curved up piece of paper like this. You can see how that mimics the style of where they roll up a piece of paper, papyrus, parchment. That's how the Ionic style got its shape, distinctive shape. And then the Corinthian using a very decorative thing with these acanthus leaves that were part of the landscape there in ancient Greece. You see this Temple of Nike, this on page 264 in your text, and you look at that, can you see what style that is? And if you say that it's Ionic, you're correct. And can you tell at the top, the capital there, what this temple at Paestum in Italy? It's the more simple style, right? So it's the Doric. Let me go back to this just for a second. And let's see if I can scroll back to this one slide. And you can see the three different types. And so, I'll scroll through these real quickly here. And you can see that this is the Ionic, and this is the Doric. So, I will say this. If any of you have opportunity to drive out, and you'd like to, and you take a photograph of especially the courthouse in Plainview and the courthouse in Levelland. There are buildings all along 19th Street. The courthouse in Lubbock used to be this Greek style, this ancient Greek style. All these federal buildings in our country, buildings in almost all courthouses in Texas, echoed the same style. But if you take a picture of one of these and you'd like to send it to me and say, Mr. Hope, this is the style, do it in the next couple of days and I'll give you some extra credit for that. So I'm going to switch back off this now and continue with the slide presentation for a few more minutes here. Okay, so let's move on. Now this is a corbelled arch. You have this on page 265. But this is an arch, and the columns are made of separate pieces, and then it spans a rounded area instead of just being a straight level across, and by these stones being angled in such a way, and then having the key part, of course, is the keystone, this wedge-shaped piece in the center that keeps that, it directs the weight of gravity downward and outward to the columns. And gravity is a force that architects and designers have to deal with. And so the arch was the next step up in building. And you see kind of a different style there in this treasury of Atreus. This is probably a burial mound instead of a treasury, but that's what it became known as. But you can see how the load of gravity, how it directs the weight outward and downward through the post. Now this is the Pont de Garde in Nîmes, France. This is an aqueduct and bridge built by the Romans. You can see 1st century, so it's 2,000 years old, and it still functions today. It's a tourist attraction. Water still flow through that. There's a Google Earth view of that. Water still flowed through that and was used by people until just a few years ago, but there's an internal channel that can still be used. They've decided to go with a pipeline because it was easier to maintain. But the Romans were pretty amazing. They brought water from the mountains down to the lower towns through the system of aqueducts. And they still use some of these aqueducts. They bring water into cities like Rome. Here's the church of Saint Madeleine, and you have this on page 267 in your text. You can see the archways there a little bit in this design, repeated archways. And repeated archways make a barrel vault. And of course, the weight is directed outward and downward through that arch, and it's just a system of the same thing, the keystones there. Concrete, I've asked students this before, and I think it was one of the things on the pretest. How old is concrete? Well, concrete has been around since the Roman times. It's over 2,000 years old. They invented it, not the Egyptians, not the modern Americans or Europeans. The Romans were using it back then. They built the Colosseum with it. They built a number of structures with it. The Pantheon is the bottom structure there that's just up the street from Colosseum. But I have something here about this in your notes. And if you look at this, it talks about different things about concrete. And you'll see that when it talks about concrete, it talks about using reinforced concrete. And I kind of skipped ahead to the next page there with slides. But you'll see this all over. When you see construction being done, you've seen these reinforcing bars or steel rebars. They're linked together with wire. Then they pour concrete in there. It makes it even stronger. So we have most foundations in all buildings and many highways, all the freeways and big cities are made with the same method. It's very strong. Now, the Colosseum in Rome has suffered over the years with earthquakes and so on, but you can walk there now, and it's an incredible thing to see this. They've stripped away some of the facing stone, which is very beautiful, but part of that outside collapsed in an earthquake years ago, but it's still an amazing structure, and it stands because of the engineering with concrete. You walk up the street a few blocks in Rome, you can get to the Pantheon, and it's this amazing dome that's made with concrete. And they use a special kind of concrete in this. I'm going to switch back to this, and I'll be changing to the next set of slides here in a moment. But when you look at an archway and you look at a vault, it's using the principle of the keystone and the weight of gravity directed outward and downward. And so a dome is just that on a 360. It's just basically using that same principle of directing the gravity and the force and the weight outward and downward. On the full dome, it's doing it in 360 instead of just in one little opening area. And that's what this signifies here, showing the weight of the dome and how it's directed outward. And this used to be an illustration in the text, and I don't think that they included it, but anyway, you see different things like groin vaults where two intersecting vaults, and again, using the principle of the keystone, and you can see pointed arches, but they're using basically the same principle. You have this on page 268, the Gothic architectural features, and this is a cross shape that's used in most churches, but it was an offshoot of what the Romans did. We'll talk about that later when they built their temples. But the apse is where usually the pulpit or the worship center is, and that large nave, and you have aisles on the side. That's usually where the congregation sits. But you have this cross shape here, and you see where these other chapels are added on to that. But you see that same structure. Here's the Gothic style. And we'll talk about Gothic style later. But any Gothic architectural style is an archway that has a pointed top to it. And you can remember that. Now here's the Gateway Arch, and I think I'm including a little virtual tour of this. If you've never been there, you need to put that on your list. It's in St. Louis. And this is the place, the jumping off point for Lewis and Clark when they did the great exploration of the territory that had just been added to the United States, the Louisiana Purchase. And so Saarinen built this with steel, stainless steel, and it's a marvel of engineering. And you can ride up inside that. By the way, there's McDonald's in that boat there, so on the left. Everything's closed down now, though, right? And so they put many things online, so I'm going to be sending those links to you. But if you get in there, you'll watch the little film looking on this side for the Gateway Arch, and you get in these little rounded cars, and they rotate because it takes you right up to the top, and it's a little claustrophobic maybe for some people, but it's kind of exciting. And then you get up to the top, and you're standing at the very top of the arch and looking down. You may have been in big buildings before. It's kind of disconcerting to some people. My wife couldn't hardly stand it because you look down and you don't see anything underneath you because you're on the top of an archway. And it's using kind of the same principle except with steel and not with stone. But it's an amazing thing to stand there and you look out across the Mississippi River and across the city. So it's a pretty great experience. Now we'll talk about these stained glass windows, and you have this Gothic architecture allowed these windows to be built because they could support it with these archways and domes, so they could have these huge stained glass windows like this one in the Abbey Church of Saint Denis in France. And we'll talk about the Hagia Sophia. Some people say Hagia Sophia, but you see the multiple domes there, and you see the minarets that were added. This was built as a Christian church in what then was called Constantinople. Constantine was the emperor, and we'll talk about Constantine, how he allowed Christianity, and this is an amazing historic site that you can visit now. It's not used as a worship center anymore. It's just a World Heritage Site. And you see these multiple domes in there, huge structure, really incredible. Now I'm going to stop right here with Pendentives, and we'll go on there, but you can see how the archway on four sides has a dome on top, and that's basically what you see when you see this structure right here, except some of those are domes on the outside that go on there. Now we'll stop here and talk about this Gothic building. This is the one that burned this last summer, Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. And I'll stop here. That's about 25 minutes, about half the lecture. So we'll go on here in a bit.